Pasumai Thaayagam, the British Tamil Forum, and the United States Tamil Political Action Council, USTPAC. And I'm delighted that we have the head of the British Tamil Forum with us on this occasion, Kumar, sitting on this side, and some members of his team. It's, I think, a sign of the very special relationship between Sri Lanka and the Human Rights Council that at this session, when Sri Lanka is not on the official agenda of the Council, there have been somewhat in the region of 20-25 side events dealing with the situation in Sri Lanka and prospects. But that underlines the complex relationship between Sri Lanka and the Council, which has got really two parts. One part is what I would call the normal relationship between any state and the Council, and that is reflected in the reviews by the Universal Periodic Review process, where the commitments entered into by the government of Sri Lanka on behalf of its people are reviewed by the peers of that country through the Human Rights Council. That is in addition to what we call the special procedures. And I would mention that because Sri Lanka has engaged, after a period of almost a decade of non-engagement, has in the past 2 years engaged in an extraordinary manner with the special procedures of the Council. There have been visits by the Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances, the special rapporteurs on torture, on independence of judges and lawyers, and on minority issues. There have been reviews by the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the CAT, the Torture Committee, CEDAW, Committee on the Advancement of Women, and the Committee on the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And for the first time for many years, Sri Lanka has submitted reports to all of those. As we speak, we're on the eve of 3 more country visits, which I would mention. Mr. Pablo de Grief, the Special Rapporteur on Truth, Justice, Reparations and Guarantees of Non-Recurrence, will be visiting Sri Lanka just next month. And obviously in the context of the debate on constitutional reform, which would constitute the main guarantee of non-recurrence. That debate has now been officialized by the presentation of a report. In December, there will be a visit by the Working Group on Arbitrary Detentions. And early next year, to date still to be fixed, there will be a visit by the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression. Now this obviously constitutes what I would say an acceleration of the normal relationship between Sri Lanka and the Council after some years of interruption. There is, at the same time, a second element to the relationship, and that is the implementation by the government and the people of Sri Lanka of commitments that the government entered into voluntarily before its peers in co-sponsoring the resolution 30/1 on reconciliation, accountability and human rights in Sri Lanka. That is what makes the case of Sri Lanka special in the Council. It is an innovative approach which was based on the assumption that the government has the political will, the capacity to overcome obstacles to the implementation of its commitments. Now, as you will read from the flyer that we have before us, there is some doubt both as to the political will and the capacity of government to implement. And this comes in the face of what are particularly serious delays in that process of implementation. And I'm hoping that the event we have today will help to cast light on some aspects of those delays and to explain why there is such concern that the government of Sri Lanka may not be willing or in a position, and for me personally, the jury is out as to which of those it is, to fully implement the commitments that it has entered into. So that is, I think, the purpose of our event today. And we have a wonderful panel of specialists or people committed to the seek for reconciliation, accountability and the furtherance of human rights in Sri Lanka on the podium. The first person I'm going to introduce is actually unfortunately not with us, but he's joining us by a video that he, I think, was able to make just yesterday, so it is very much up to date. And that is Mr. Richard Gowing, who is the director of the Sri Lanka campaign for peace and justice, which is based in London. And Richard is, I hope, going to be able to provide us with what the campaign has done so far quite regularly, which is an update of progress on the implementation of Resolution 30/1 and the commitments that were then renewed under Resolution 34/1. So I'm going to turn to Richard if I...
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to the British Tamils Forum for inviting me to what I'm sure will be an engaging discussion on the state of human rights in Sri Lanka, and which I hope will also be an opportunity to bring into focus some of the challenges for civil society in member states as we look ahead to the 37th session of the Council in March 2018. I'm very sorry not to be able to be there in person today, hence why instead you're watching this, a pre-recorded message on Tuesday the 26th. My name is Richard Gowing and I'm the campaign director at the Sri Lanka Campaign for Peace and Justice. We're an advocacy organisation based in London and we work to support various partners in Sri Lanka, including members of war-affected communities, particularly in the north and east, activists and human rights defenders, to help strengthen respect for human rights, and within that to ensure that the government is embarked on a process of reconciliation which is meaningful, sustainable, and which really coheres with the needs and wishes of war survivors. I've been invited to say a few words today about the government's progress with respect to this process, and in particular its progress in implementing the range of measures that it co-sponsored as part of Resolution 31, latterly subsumed, of course, by Resolution 34/1. I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with the history and context in which this initial resolution came about. But to be sure, this was a resolution passed with the support of the government in October 2015, prompted and shaped largely by the findings of the investigation of the High Commissioner for Human Rights into Sri Lanka, the so-called OASL report. That report, which looked into the final stages of the civil war and its aftermath, found that there was evidence of grave violations of human rights that it suggested would likely constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity if established in a court of law. The report went on to recommend a broad range of measures for dealing with the past and restoring the rule of law, including, among others, recommendations for a hybrid accountability mechanism incorporating international judges and prosecutors, as well as for various other non-judicial measures, so institutions for truth-seeking, for the tracing of the disappeared, and for the provision of reparations to victims. It also suggested the adoption of a range of confidence-building measures, including the demilitarisation of the north and east, the return of military-held lands to civilian owners, the vetting of public officials, and the repeal of repressive counter-terrorism legislation. And most of those proposals found their way into the text of 31, which initially mandated a reporting timeline of 2 years. Sometime after the passage of the resolution, we launched a new project called Keep the Promise, the aim of which was really to ensure that the government would be living up to its commitments under the resolution. And as part of this, we broke the text down into a list of 25 specific commitments, which you should be able to see on the screen, each of which we scored on a 3-tier colour-coded scale. So green to reflect those commitments that were completely or mostly achieved, amber for those partially achieved, and red for those mostly or completely not achieved. So our first assessment was conducted in mid-2016, and it in many ways reflected the cautious optimism about the government's willingness to reckon with the legacy of the war, there being significant, if geographically and ethnically uneven, improvements in civil society space and room for dissent. At that time, a large share of the commitments really fell into the fourth category, too soon to tell, really reflecting the fact that the government had by then begun preparing the work of the Consultation Task Force, this a civil society-led body tasked with making recommendations on the design and implementation of the transitional justice processes based on the views and wishes of affected communities. But that cautious hope really began to unravel during the second half of 2016, when I think it's fair to say the government started to lose the initiative on transitional justice, or more accurately perhaps, that it began to feel that it had the political space to backtrack on key commitments. This here is the outcome of our analysis for the February 2017 session earlier this year. And I won't go into all of the areas of concern that it raises, but I think there are three developments in particular in the intervening period which are worth flagging. So first was the quite significant shift in the government's rhetoric on accountability. Having road tested publicly some statements against foreign intervention, it was really in the later part of 2016 where we began to hear from the President and the Prime Minister some quite categorical rejections of the idea of foreign judges participating in an accountability mechanism. And second was the fact that where progress had been made on the passing of legislation to establish an Office of Missing Persons in particular, that this was largely done without proper consultation and feeding into a view that the government was simply announcing mechanisms for international consumption. And finally, it was really in this period that the government's attitude to the consultations process became clear. Ultimately, far worse than the chronic under-resourcing and the absence of political support for the consultation task force during its functioning was the fact that the government almost completely ignored its final report. The President and the Prime Minister both failing to turn up for its official launch and really taking no steps subsequently to establish a process for the review or the adoption of its recommendations. And as arguably one of the best blueprints Sri Lanka has ever had for addressing the past, and one generally speaking with the confidence of war-affected communities, the treatment of the CTF to date is really nothing less than a tragedy. Fortunately, as the government neared the end of that initial 2-year monitoring period, sensing what did in fact transpire to be a very strong report from the High Commissioner's Office, as well as a mood in the Council cognizant of the overwhelming lack of progress, it did agree in March 2017 to the so-called technical rollover of the resolution, extending its terms for a further 2 years and mandating oral and written updates at the forthcoming sessions in March 2018 and March 2019. Rather unfortunately, however, the good faith invested by civil society in the extension of that process really hasn't been repaid by the government. And as I'm sure will be apparent from those speaking after me, and indeed other participants at this month's session, the past 6 months have been an immensely frustrating period of stasis. I think the Special Rapporteur on Counter-Terrorism, who visited in July, really hit the nail on the head when he wrote in his final report that progress on transitional justice has ground to a virtual halt. Even worse, perhaps, and of great concern to us, is that we've even seen some quite alarming backsliding in the ground situation. And I'm thinking here in particular of the harassment of various activists, protesters, and lawyers in the past few months. We'll be releasing a full and updated version of our scorecard in the new year ahead of the March session, but our preliminary assessment currently looks something like this. So this really prompts the question of what next and what the Council and its member states should be doing ahead of March. Well, I think there are really 2 or 3 key priorities for the next few months and indeed years. First and foremost, I think it needs to be made abundantly clear to the government that the international community is committed over the long term and that the government's seeming strategy simply to wait things out isn't viable. And that really means signalling that if necessary and where commitments under 31 aren't implemented, that there will be a further monitoring process beyond March 2019 with reporting either under item 2 or possibly under item 10. And on that note, I mean, I very much hope that those members of the Council that have been so active in leading and championing the process to date do remain committed and engaged to see things through. But where that's not the case, that they, at the very least, refrain from prematurely chalking Sri Lanka up as a country-specific success story of the Council, and that they do encourage the passing of the baton to new champions. Second, and a bit of a however, I would strongly encourage Member States to recognise that the next 18 months present a window of opportunity in Sri Lanka that we might never see again, with the prospect of parliamentary and presidential elections in 2020, for reasons I'm sure many will understand, holding the potential to severely limit the possibility for progress beyond March 2019. And my warning to council members is really that unless reforms move forwards and are entrenched now during this critical period, there's a real risk of a major reversal down the line, one that could undo the gains made by the council over the past few years. And specifically, I think this means that there has to be a shift in the tone and the approach of the international community. And I really urge delegates to look afresh with their counterparts in capitals and in Colombo at whether the current strategies in Sri Lanka are working in the context of what needs to happen come March 2019. There's really a strong perception among many in Sri Lanka that the international community has far too readily reset its relations with the current government, and that the enthusiasm on trade, as we've seen with the recent restoration of GSP Plus, as well as in the military spheres and on peacekeeping, have undermined the leverage that the international community possesses. The received wisdom endorsed and pushed by the government in recent months, as well as at the General Assembly last week, is really that more robust engagement could jeopardise the prospects for success. But I think the bottom line is really that if the level of pressure continues at the status quo, failure is almost guaranteed. Council members will, I'm sure, be inundated with a number of specific recommendations in the run-up to March, but there are just a few that I would emphasise at this stage. I think first is the urgent need to re-empower the report of the consultation task force and to see the development of a clear timetable by the government for the implementation of the recommendations made by it. Second, I think there needs to be some coordinated pressure from the international community to encourage the government to deliver on some of the lower hanging fruit offered in 31, and I would include within that the operationalisation of the Office of Missing Persons, the criminalisation of enforced disappearances, land returns, and indeed the repeal of the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And finally, I would also encourage Member States to return to some of the ambition on achieving accountability, which was really at the core of the recommendations of the OSL report, and indeed Resolution 31. I think it really remains true, as it was then, that it's this lack of accountability and the impunity that it engenders, which represents the biggest threat to the sustainability of Sri Lanka's peace in the long term. And I, for one, would like to see that reflected much more assertively in not just the words, but also the actions of Member States. And with that, I think I will wrap up and hand over. But thank you for listening, and do please keep an eye out for our updated report in the new year. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, if you can hear, which I doubt. Yeah, I think Richard has really provided us with an excellent overall framework. We have been through these periods of optimism which has rapidly been dashed off one many times over by delays and inaction. And we now are facing the growing challenge of what to do in the face of a situation where the government does not appear to be willing or able to implement commitments that it has made to the Council. It's a new challenge. Some declared the Sri Lanka Human Rights Council process rather early as a success, one of the rare country-specific success stories of the Council. That was in October 2015. We're now 2 full years later. And I think it is rather clear to us all that it was maybe a little hasty to declare success until something had changed on the ground. Richard mentioned in particular the importance of action on confidence building measures. Those low-hanging fruits, the things that we all thought possible for the government to take action on, which did not, it appears, require overcoming insurmountable political obstacles. And it is on those that I think we're now going to focus, because among those low-hanging fruits, the ones the government itself thought that it would be able to deliver on urgently, were the Prevention of Terrorism Act, its repeal and replacement, torture, enforced disappearances, and land release. So now I'm going to ask our next two speakers. I'm going to start with Antonia Benfield, who is a London-based barrister specializing in human rights and refugee law. I'm going to ask Antonia if she could steer us through the complexities of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, its repeal and replacement, and torture situation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. As David has said, I propose to deal with the Prevention of Terrorism Act, looking firstly at its history and scope, then at its use in ongoing human rights violations, and then consider what proposals have been put in place for the repeal and replacement of the Act. The Prevention of Terrorism Act, of course, was first enacted as a temporary measure in 1979. It was enacted in the context of civil war and pervasive ethnic tension to counter, essentially, terrorist insurgency. I think it's important to note that at the time of the inception and discussions about the Act, the then leader of the opposition, the Tamil United Liberation Front, condemned the law in the strongest possible terms on the grounds that it had clear scope to be used to silence critics and political opponents. And secondly, that it was clearly intended to target the Tamil population and therefore had a clear ethnic bias. I think it's important to keep this in mind when considering that now, decades on, these are still concerns and criticisms that many of us have. It's fair to say that the Prevention of Terrorism Act has attracted universal condemnation as a measure that is wholly inconsistent with contemporary human rights standards, that not only permits but encourages pervasive violation of fundamental rights, otherwise protected by the Constitution of Sri Lanka, but also international human rights and humanitarian law. In summary, the PTA allows for the arrest of terrorist suspects in the absence of formal charges and allows for protracted administrative detention without judicial oversight. The absence of judicial oversight, of course, is concerning for a number of reasons. Firstly, because of the approach to the rule of law and the violation of those principles, but also the position that it leaves many individuals in lengthy periods of detention with simply nothing that they can do. It's a point that's been raised by the Special Rapporteur, Ben Emerson, that there have been suspects languishing in detention for a period of decades without being brought to trial, and simply that is something that must be condemned in the strongest possible terms. Provisions of the Act have been described universally as draconian, and when the PTA itself is reviewed, it's clear that even speaking in a manner that is deemed to promote racial disharmony, or failing to report other persons suspected of offences to the police, carry lengthy criminal sentences. Many people detained under the PTA are not told of the case against them and therefore clearly can't put forward an effective defence, and are regularly detained incommunicado in detention sites that are not official places of detention, which has led to the situation that we now see of secret detention sites and army camps in Sri Lanka being used to detain people over protracted periods. A further concerning measure, and this is something that I'll come to when looking at the revisions to the potential counter-terrorism legislation, is that the Act unusually allows for a confession to be made to a police officer whilst an individual is in custody under investigation. And of course this is in contradiction with the Sri Lankan Penal Code that allows only for a confession to be made to a magistrate. And really in this provision we see where the concern stems about torture and ill treatment in detention for the purpose of extracting confessions. This is really a focus of concern in legislation moving forward. So really, in that brief summary, it's entirely apparent that it's appropriate to describe the PTA as draconian and a legal mechanism that should be condemned in the strongest possible terms. That the Prevention of Terrorism Act is a tool that gives legitimacy to gross human rights violations is well documented. Informed commentators, NGOs, the United Nations itself has raised concerns about human rights violations under the PTA since the 1980s. And again, I think this is important when considering statements made by the Sri Lankan government at the present time in implementing HRC resolutions, that this is not a new subject in Sri Lankan legal development. Essentially, the PTA has allowed for torture and extrajudicial detention to become endemic in Sri Lanka. And this is a core issue in terms of moving forward to try and adopt mechanisms that get away from the fact that torture is really ingrained within the security apparatus in Sri Lanka. The pattern of gross human rights violations has been repeated for decades, and I think this is a point that cannot be emphasised enough. And that it must be a clear focus moving forward, and that the PTA must be repealed, but also effectively replaced with legislation that brings effective accountability and brings perpetrators to justice. As I've stated, there have been repeated patterns of commitments being made by the Sri Lankan government to reform and repeal the PTA, not only in the course of commitments made since Resolution 31, but looking back to the 1990s, it's important, as is documented in the Human Rights Watch World Report of 1997, to note that the Sri Lankan government at that time gave a clear commitment to create a committee looking at detentions under the PTA to ascertain the number of individuals detained under the provisions, to expedite cases and recommend release. And so again, when coming back to concerns being raised by civil society groups and by victims and their families, it is concerning that these commitments, now made some 20 years ago, have had little effect. As was reviewed a moment ago by Richard in his video address, and not a point that I will deal with in length, it's important to consider that in Resolution 31, the Sri Lankan government made clear commitment to review and repeal the PTA and to replace it with anti-terrorism legislation that accorded with international best practices. In March 2017, of course, the Human Rights Council reviewed the process on all markers, but in particular in relation to the PTA, and concluded that significant work needed to be done. Resolution 31.4, of course, saw the Sri Lankan government given a further period of 2 years to implement the agreed measures. And so what can therefore be seen is a continuing period of delay without effective implementation. As was reported by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights earlier this month, there has been a distinct lack of progress, and as Richard cited, as Special Rapporteur Ben Emerson said, progress on key goals has really ground to a halt. After being allowed access to detention sites, the Special Rapporteur reports that detainees continue to be held under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. There continue to be new arrests under the PTA, and individuals continue to be subjected to extremely brutal methods of torture. Of course, it's important to consider that the Special Rapporteur was visiting in July of this year and was collecting up-to-date testimony from individuals held in detention. And that is something that should be considered alongside the Sri Lankan government's commitment to effective end to oppressive counter-terrorism mechanisms. It's clear, therefore, from the Special Rapporteur's findings that notwithstanding commitments made, although he notes that there has been a decline in the use of PTA over recent months, It is still operational, it is still on the statute books, and there are still a significant number of individuals who are, in effect, languishing in detention without access to justice. Moving forward, of course, there have been proposed provisions put forward by the Sri Lankan government and proposed amendments to counter-terrorism legislation. In April of this year, the Sri Lankan cabinet approved the final version of the policy and legal framework relating to proposed counter-terrorism in Sri Lanka. Reviewing the proposals, however, the commitments made to the UN Human Rights Council in 2015 must be brought forward. The Special Rapporteur in particular raised concerns in his July address about the proposed terms of replacement legislation and has offered increased dialogue to essentially review and bring the proposed legislation in line with human rights norms. Of course, that is a welcome measure and something that it is hoped that the Sri Lankan government will engage with. The terms of the proposed Counter-Terrorism Act on review are concerning, and individuals have every right to be concerned about the fact that they maintain the ability to arrest, to subject individuals to lengthy pre-charge administrative detention. It's a fundamental issue that particularly a Special Rapporteur picked up on, that the definition of terrorism remains in the proposed new legislation, something that is vague and broad. This, of course, is a key issue under the PTA as it stands. It fails, of course, to give legal certainty and opens the legislation up to abuse. The risk of abuse, of course, is further heightened by the proposed terms in the Counter-Terrorism Act for a lack of judicial oversight. And again, in my opinion, this is one of the critical issues of the PTA. It fails to give us effective safeguards, and there are concerns that as it stands, the CTA, as proposed, will do little to address torture in Sri Lanka. The terms, therefore, that are presently proposed are clearly unacceptable and require substantial revision to end what is discriminatory and abusive application of counter-terrorism law. The proposals fail to live up to promises made by the Sirisena government to replace the PTA with a human rights compliant framework for counter-terrorism. What clearly is required is an ongoing intensive oversight of any proposed legislation, and of course it is hoped that through engagement with the Special Rapporteur and other bodies, the legislation can be substantially revised before it is enacted to ensure that it provides an effective change to the PTA, which has been a licence for state oppression, and there of course is a need for durable change in the law on counter-terrorism, and it is hoped that that is something that can be achieved.
Thank you, Antonia. And now for the second part of the confidence building measures, the anticipated addressing of at least one priority issue, that of enforced disappearances, and the progressive realization of promises to return land to their owners. Yves Bowie is the campaign director of the Society for Threatened Peoples, and he has had the great privilege of having spent quite some time in Sri Lanka in the course of this year. So,
thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak here on this argument. So I will, in the beginning, cover enforced disappearances. In Sri Lanka, enforced disappearances of government critics has actually a long tradition. Already in the 1970s and 80s, at least 30,000 and possibly up to 60,000 Sinhalese students were either abducted or killed during the government offenses against the Marxist movement of the JVP. Then, during the civil war between the Sri Lankan military and the liberation tigers of Tamilnadu, it was mostly Tamils with actual or suspected connections to the LTTE who disappeared, but also Sinhalese and Muslim regime critics. The overwhelming majority of documented cases indicate the direct involvement of state security forces. There is no trace of many persons who surrendered to the Sri Lankan military at the end of the war. Thus, the fate of 146,679 persons at the end of the war remains unaccounted for. Sri Lanka has made little progress in the investigation of cases of enforced disappearances. This is despite the fact that Sri Lanka has one of the highest rates of enforced disappearances worldwide. According to estimates, since 1980, about 100,000 people in Sri Lanka have forcibly disappeared. To deal with these enforced disappearances cases, Sri Lanka established actually a so-called Office for Missing Persons. This office has been established on September 12, 2017, this year, just 1.5 weeks ago. President Sirisena has issued a Gazette notification establishing the Office of Missing Persons with effect from September 15. It has taken more than a year after its adoption in Parliament to establish this ONP, and also the bill itself has been subjected to heavy criticism since it was drafted without consultation with the families of the disappeared or the civil society in general. And also it remains unclear who will be appointed to the Office for Missing Persons. The whole process is it's not transparent, and the affected communities were not consulted at all up to this point. Furthermore, the Center for Policy Alternative has expressed serious concern on the process, stating that there was a complete disregard towards the constitutional framework in Sri Lanka. Next point I want to talk about is the Convention for Protection for all persons from enforced disappearances. Sri Lanka signed the International Convention for the Protection for all persons from enforced disappearances on September 10, 2015. In May 2016, Sri Lanka ratified the convention, and in August 2016, the Parliament adopted the bill to establish the OMP. However, until now, no legal provision has been adopted to define cases of enforced disappearances as a criminal offence in the national law. And further, the Sri Lankan Prime Minister has said that the proposed bill enabling to criminalize enforced disappearances in the Sri Lankan Penal Code will be effective only for the future and not for past disappearances, which is of course in the eyes of the victims not acceptable. Then actually last week on September 21, the Parliament had wanted to debate the criminalization of enforced disappearances, but this debate was postponed, which actually shows that the Tamils are not really considered as real citizens in the country. Like Sumatran, the MP, the Tamil MP, this shows that Tamils are only fourth-class citizens. Due to the inactivity of the state, Tamil women have been protesting in the streets since spring 2017 in several places in north and eastern Sri Lanka, and they demand justice, truth and reparation. The protests, which are ongoing for over 200 days, are taking place in 5 cities. It's in Kilinochchi, where the protest started on February 20th, in Vaunia, where the protest started on February 24th, in Mullaitivu, where the protest started on March 8th, and as in Trincomalee, it started on the same day, and also in Mauntaperni on the Jaffna Peninsula, where the protest started on March 15th. And so these women are over 200 days on the streets. In 3 of the places, Kilinochchi, Vaunia and Mullaitivu, the women are even sleeping on the protest sites. So, decisive for this protest movement was actually a hunger strike started by 9 Tamil women on January 23rd, 2017 in Vaunia, which has been stopped after 4 days because they were promised a meeting with the government. However, this meeting has not brought any tangible results. I went actually to most of these protest sites myself in April this year, and I talked to the women, I listened to their cases, and here you see some pictures of the protest in Kilinochchi, where many women are there. The women told me that around 1,200 people are engaging in this process, and usually 50 to 200 are there during the day, and 20 to 25 remain overnight. Also, they get the support from local businesses, so they are providing the participants with food and also other things. Then also, here you see some more pictures of the women protesting in Kilinochchi. Then in Vanya, they also started again on February 24th, the protest. And they keep on going on, and they told me they will stay until they get answers from the government what happened to their loved ones. Here you see some more pictures of the Vanya protest. And then also in Mullaitivu, they started the protests on August 14th. Here you also can see some pictures of the protest there. In Mullaitivu, actually, two unknown persons threatened one of the leaders of the protest with death. The two men also groped and slapped her, and she was also admitted to the hospital. So you see the situation of these women activists is very serious, since they are being intimidated and also surveyed by the government or by unknown people. How we're not sure. Then for Mount Kearney, where on 15th March the protest started, I want to just tell you a quick story to see how difficult it is for these women to protest on the streets. So they started, 4 Tamil women actually, started to protest in Mount Kearney. And on the first day of the protests, for these 4 women, 23 security officers surveyed the protesting women and intimidated and photographed them. So despite these harassments by the security forces, the woman returned the next day to the protest site and kept on going till now, which is a very bold thing to do if you see all these intelligence people roaming around, taking photographs and everything. And it was also reported that an incident where a military person stopped a Tamil journalist on his way to Mount Kearney and intimidated him and forced him to return, because he wanted to cover the protests, and he was told by the military that actually this protest is not anymore ongoing. But however, we know it is still there and it is ongoing. So these women have a few demands which they want to be fulfilled, and I have some of the key demands we wrote down here. First is release the list of all who surrendered or were detained by the Sri Lankan armed forces during and after the end of the war, and in particular during the last stages of the war. Second, release the list of all detainees in secret detention centers run by the security forces. Third, release the list of all detainees being held under the PTA or emergency regulations or unlawfully in any legal detention centers. Then fourth, appointments to the OMP must be made in consultations with victims' communities. Respected, independent and credible international experts and representatives of the families of the disappeared, who are viewed as credible by victims' communities across the country, should be appointed to the OMP. Fifth, the OMP should be located in the areas where the enforced disappearances occurred. Sixth, the OMP should be linked to criminal prosecutions of the perpetrators of enforced disappearances. And when you see these demands, you can realize that actually, even though the OMP has been established, those women have not been enthusiastic about this because their demands have not been met. So it is very important, if this government wants to get the trust of the victim communities, they have to fulfill their demands. Even the president actually promised to the protesters to release the 3 lists which are here mentioned in the demands. However, to this date, these lists have not been released by President Sirisena, which also shows maybe that the willing to really investigate these cases is not there like it should be in this government. So the next point I want to cover are the land grabbing by security forces. So in the Sri Lankan Civil War, there were not only tens of thousands of people killed, but it also took a heavy toll on the lives and the livelihood of the communities in the north and east of the islands. More than 1 million people had to leave their home due to fighting or military occupation of their lands. With the end of the war, the IDPs actually hoped to soon be allowed to return home. Yet, the continuing military occupation of land keeps tens of thousands of people away from their homes and livelihoods. They still live in IDP camps or with relatives or as refugees abroad. Here you can see the government figures which were submitted to the UN Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Committee this June, I think. These are the government figures, how much acres they have been released and how much they still have. I don't want to really go into this. I rather want to talk about the ground reality of a few places where the army is either still occupying the land or just has been released, to see what is going on. Even though Sri Lanka has promised, by sponsoring the UN Resolution 30/1, to return the land to its rightful owner, the process is very slow and many land is still occupied by the military. These are the 5 places I will talk about: Kuriuku, Kepapulau, Mulikulam, Palimune, and Walikamam North. In Pilakuriupu, the villagers in the beginning of this year started protesting because several promises by military and government to release the land has never been fulfilled. So they started protesting in front of the military camp, in front of their own land. During the Human Rights Council in March this year, the government actually agreed to release 42 acres of land on March 1st this year for 48 families. This after 30 days of protest. However, the land in Pilakuriupu was hastily returned to their traditional owners. The people returned to bare jungle lands with no housing, no access to basic facilities, and since they returned, they have cleared their lands on their own with no support of the government. There are just some support of a few NGOs who help them. Furthermore, there is no public transport and no public bus. And due to the surrounding military camp, they have to go a very long way around to go to work or to go to shops or anything, because they can't walk through the military camp, which takes them, some people told me, more than 45 minutes more to get to other places. Here you can see on the one picture the military camp, actually the Air Force camp behind, and some of the women who returned to their own land. Then in Kepapulau, people are since over 200 days still protesting to get their land back. The people from Kepapulau used to cultivate their land, which they had to leave in December 2008, and since then they are banned from returning to their traditional land. Currently, they live in a so-called model village, which was built by the Sri Lankan military, where cultivation is not possible, and where they have to again walk around the military camp to get to the lagoon where these people used to fish. So it takes a really long time to get there for them. Subsequently, a lot of the villagers from Kepapulau have lost their traditional livelihood. So finally, this year the people start to a continuous protests. On March 1st, the villagers went to the entrance of the military camp, where the land is situated, to demand the release of the traditional land. They stated that they would not leave until they get their land back. So until today, they are still there and protesting in front of the Security Forces headquarters, Mulaitivu. Then I want to quickly talk about another case in Mulikulam. In Mulikulam, which is close to Mannar, in September 2007, around 400 families were displaced. Some of them later built temporary houses next to Mulikulam in bare jungle lands. And some they lived in relatives' houses, and some, around 100 families, are currently actually in India and waiting to return. On March this year, on March 23rd, this year, people of Molekulam started protesting to reclaim their land. Here you see some pictures of the mostly women actually protesting. So their protest was initially actually successful. So the Navy has assured that they would immediately release 100 acres of land to the people in Molekulam on April 23rd, after 38 days of continuous process. However, up to date, this land has not been released. The people can't go to their own land. The only thing they got is the access to the church, where you can see on these pictures, and also the land around there. So these people feel betrayed and deceived by everyone, by the government, by the Navy, and even by the local church, because they are guilty in their view of not doing enough to give them a dignified life. Another case I just want to quickly highlight is in Palais, which is very close to Manal and on the island as well. There, the military has occupied 25 houses. This is about 2 to 3 acres. Here, the interesting thing is that 19 court cases were filed, and some are still ongoing, but nothing has happened since then. So the people are still not allowed to return to their own land. Even though it's a small place and a small community, I think it's always good to highlight these places as well. Then I also wanted to very quickly talk about Whaley North on the Jaffna Peninsula. There the military has seized significant pieces of land and declared them as a so-called high security zones, needed for security reasons, etc. There have been a resettlement process going on, and some people have been resettled to their traditional land where fishing and farming is possible. However, some people have been resettled to areas where they were resettled without their consent, which are mostly unsuitable for agriculture and fishing. So they can't develop their traditional livelihood they used to have before. And another very bad thing, here you can also see some of the release lands. And another very bad problem is the IDP camps. Still many IDP camps, I think over 30, are still functioning on the Jaffna Peninsula. And the inhabitants of these camps face a number of social and economic challenges in their everyday life. They only have a restricted access to drinking water, and the sanitary facilities are not enough. Flooding after rain and garbage lying around are huge problems, as well causing much trouble and increasing the risk for accidents and the spreading of diseases. Moreover, the very precarious living conditions in IDP camp are a huge challenge for the inhabitants. There is no possibility to gain a regular daily income, and the monthly income is often exceeded by the monthly expenses. Women in IDP camps, especially from female-headed households, do not feel safe due to the lack of privacy, and they struggle to meet their family's basic needs, which can research to hunger and malnutrition. So it is very important that all these people in that IDP camps can return to their traditional land to develop their own livelihood. In this year, in April this year, actually, we had a big workshop with landless communities all over the island. It was organized by Society for Threatened People and our local partners, the National Fisheries Solidarity Movement. And those people who joined in this workshop, and which are all affected people, we all came together and we wrote down the demands. So this Nalu Declaration, how we call it, is the demands of the landless communities in Sri Lanka. And these landless communities include also Muslim and Sinhalese. It's not only North and East, just to, to clarify. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yves. I think that together, Richard, Antonia and Yves have provided us with a very clear picture of the current situation. I think they've helped us to understand why the people on the ground, the civil society activists in Colombo, and those of us who are in Geneva or elsewhere observing, feel so frustrated at the lack of progress in the implementation of the commitments made. I think it also explains why there is a sense of frustration among some of Sri Lanka's traditional partners, that even when they've been told that action is about to be taken, and I'm giving the example of the repeal of the PTA, which was a condition for the reinstatement of Sri Lanka under the GSP+, which took place, but the promised 2 weeks later repeal of the PTA did not take place. I think it explains some of those frustrations. But obviously, it's clear that the Human Rights Council, the UN system, and its Sri Lankan partners face huge challenges in continuing to accompany Sri Lanka in its search for reconciliation, accountability, and human rights. I think that there is still hope that the government will accelerate its actions over the next 6 months. And I underline that that is the critical period before the country's normal confrontational politics is resumed in the run-up to new elections. But I think that it is also time that we start to have doubts, serious doubts about that, and that we start looking at alternatives should the government continue to fail to deliver. Now for that I'm going to introduce Mr. Paul Scully, who is a member of the British Parliament, the United Kingdom Parliament, and has the great privilege, I think, of being the chair of the all-party parliamentary group for Tamils. Maybe you can start by giving us a little explanation for those who are not British, who do not understand what these committees actually do.
Thank you, David. Yes, the all-party parliamentary groups are basically a mechanism, really, in the UK Parliament of showing an interest in specific areas, whether it be country, an area of medicine, culture, community, or whatever. In many ways, a simple version is like a university club, I guess, but we can set it up and then speak at length and bring in authoritative evidence to tackle a particular interest or area. In this case, with a significant Tamil community in my part of southwest London that I represent, sharing their concerns about what's going on in Sri Lanka was an obvious choice for me to make when I first got elected in Parliament. I hope that what you've heard actually brings home the fact to you, to people that you speak to people that may be watching this online in some format, that this is very much a live, ongoing issue. To some parts of the media and some people, they will just see this as part of a reconciliation process for the atrocities that happened back in 2009 and before. But this is very much, as you've heard, an ongoing situation. That's been, as well as the speakers here, you can see that it's been incredibly well captured by Ben Emerson, the Special Rapporteur. We've heard that he described progress as being slow and grinding to a virtual halt. We've heard that little evidence that perpetrators of war crimes have been brought to justice, and that none of the measures so far adopted to fulfil Sri Lankan transitional justice commitments are adequate to ensure real progress. Antonia spoke of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which Emerson describes as deeply flawed, with its use of uncorroborated confessions to police officers. He speaks about the endemic and systematic use of torture, and the fact that entire communities are stigmatised and targeted for harassment. Some of the ongoing, and I mean ongoing, examples of torture that Emerson talks about are beatings with sticks, the use of stress positions, asphyxiation with plastic bags drenched in kerosene, pulling out of fingernails, insertion of needles beneath fingernails, water torture, suspension of individuals for several hours by their thumbs, and mutilation of genitals. Now, I'm sorry to be so stark about this, but it's really important to hammer home the examples that the United Nations Special Rapporteur himself is using to demonstrate ongoing human rights concerns. This is why we need to keep pushing as an international community. He also speaks about industrial scale injustice, and the successor for the PTA so far still has central flaws. But then he finishes on a positive note. He says there is still time to get this legislation right, and for it to become the cornerstone of a new order in Sri Lanka. And I think that's really important to grab hold of, and for us as an international community to help push the Sri Lankan government into more action. I've just returned from Bangladesh. I was in the Rohingya camps in Cox's Bazar last year. My father was born in Burma, so I'm half Burmese, so I have a particular interest in that area there. And there are, I think, a few examples from both countries that will be instructive and useful for Sri Lanka. In Bangladesh, some of you will know that they had a terrible war of independence in 1971. And if you look at the politics in Bangladesh now, 40 years later, you can still see the echoes of the damage that were caused by the division of communities back 40 odd years ago. That's still live now. And that's one of the things that happens when you don't get hold of a reconciliation process early post-conflict. In Burma, we had high hopes for what was happening in Burma when Aung San Suu Kyi took over in government. There was always an expectation, an unrealistic expectation, that things would change overnight. Of course, when you've seen such darkness for 60 years as they've had in Burma, and it's just opening up to the international world, that was never going to happen. But with 430,000, it was 420,000 when I first got to Bangladesh, it's now 430,000 people from the Rohingya community over in Bangladesh, out of a total population of 1.3 million people. You can see that things are actually going from bad to worse at the moment. Albeit, the risk is that in Burma, is that if we don't tackle the situation now, or we go in the wrong direction, then Burma may close in on itself again, creates a vacuum, and that creates tension for other ethnic states. So what we need to do is work with, coming back to Sri Lanka, is work with Sri Lanka, in the government, in a practical, productive way, and see, and I think Resolution 30/1 absolutely has that at its heart. It has a pathway which has been described by the High Commissioner, which has been described by people on the panel today. There is a pathway that can bring the communities back together again. It was disappointing, though, to read that at another side event, a speaker was talking about that resolution being illegal, describing it as being seriously flawed, full of contradictions, omissions, lies, obfuscations, and half-truths. I ask him and I ask others to set that debate aside. Stop trying to unpick the resolution and undermine that resolution. That debate has happened. The Sri Lankan government is behind the resolution at the time of writing, but obviously things are starting to unpick themselves now, which is why we really do need to get them back on track, get them back on focus. Instead, we need to use the resolution and action as an opportunity to strengthen government, to strengthen its perception and strengthen its relations, both within the country and within the international community as well. We can unite the country if we get this right, learning lessons from radicalisation, because the last thing you want is for a vacuum to occur. Anywhere around the world, if we've learned any lessons, whether it's in the Middle East, North Africa, and other parts of the world, any sense of vacuum, any sense of dissatisfaction leads to unrest and, worst of all, radicalisation, and that's the last thing we want, is to any return to sort of any sense of active conflict. The other lesson that we can learn, I believe, from Bangladesh is that there are 500,000 British Bangladeshis, 500,000 Bangladeshis in the UK, and they really do act as a champion for that country. When someone looks for trade, looks for opportunities, investment, and these kind of things, you will have 500,000 people in Britain telling you what a fantastic country and opportunities there are in Dhaka, Sylhet, and other parts of Bangladesh. What you can do with the diaspora group, the Tamil diaspora group, who are incredibly literate, who are very, very successful, hard-working, the 2,500 Tamils in my small part of southwest London are testament to that. Instead of being fierce critics of Sri Lanka, can, if focused, if we can get this right, actually become champions for Sri Lanka in the future. but we need to go a long way down the line before we can get there. And it can then allow Sri Lanka to truly prosper. So what about actions? We've heard some of those actions now. We do need a successor to the Prevention of Terrorism Act, but it needs to be fully consulted on. Ben Emerson talked about the fact that the government had promised over the following 2 weeks following his report in July that they would open up talks with him and his office. Well, I haven't heard anything. We're in the right place to find out, but I've seen nothing in the media to see what's happened since then, so I'd be really interested to see if there is any progress. We do need to get the Office of Missing Persons operational. We need to resolve the long pending cases under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. It's all very well moving forward and changing the legislation from now onwards, but what about the many, many people that still have cases pending under those rules? We need, as Yves has told you, we need to speed up the return of land as well and make it fair that people can actually have the land that is rightfully theirs and it's not obstructed by whether it be military camps, whether it be because it's been denuded over the many years since it's been taken from them. But we do need to look back at the conflict as well, the terrible conflict that ended in the peninsula in 2009, and have a justice and reconciliation process which gives confidence to both sides, because it's the reason, there is a reason that there is such a big Tamil diaspora in the UK, and they're incredibly welcome to be in the UK in my part of London, but they're not all there by choice. They're there because they were fleeing for their lives. And if anyone wants to go back, whether it's to go back permanently, whether it's to invest, they want to make sure that they are safe, that their families are safe, that if they are speaking in the UK or anywhere in the world, that there won't be ramifications for people that they have left behind in Sri Lanka. And that can only be done if we have a judicial process that they feel, and people that have been wronged can feel comfortable actually standing in front of, giving their testimony, meaning that those people that they are giving testimony to were not part of that conflict themselves, and that are not going to have, that are going to give them a fair hearing. At the end of the day, that is what is required to bring that chapter, that dark, dark chapter of Sri Lanka's history to a close. So how can we support that? Well, each of us as politicians and NGOs in the audience can go back to our countries and speak in our parliaments and speak to your politicians and make sure that you're asking your foreign ministers what they are doing to raise these issues with the Sri Lankan counterparts, each individual component part, because then the more pressure that's brought on in each individual component part, hopefully we can get some progress. But if we can have, and it's been suggested that if we can have High Commissioner offices, specifically in the north and the east, where they are most required to actually monitor progress, then that will help the international community really keep abreast of the situation, rather than having to come back here every few months and then second guessing the Sri Lankan government. The last thing we want to do is keep pushing this, kicking this into the long grass, kicking this from session to session to session, allowing it to be unpicked at each time. We've heard how they've already had an extension through to 2019. The last thing we need is for this to get to 2019 and then sit back and hear a report. Well, actually, sorry guys, not much has happened. We can't allow that to happen. Not just because we need to keep the government on their toes, but this, as I said right at the beginning, is affecting real life people right now, every single day. And what is this place? What is the United Nations if it's not for actually tackling these, coming together as an international community to bring this together? So I say this as a critical friend of Sri Lanka. I don't say this as, it's very easy, especially when we get involved in, you've got 3 Brits on the panel here. When you have people like ourselves getting involved in Asian issues, well, it's all very well for you. You know, we have our recent colonial past. This is very much about learning lessons. The Brits have, we had Theresa Villiers here a couple of weeks ago. She's the former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. We've been through a very painful process in Britain over the last century about separatist situation in Northern Ireland and the Troubles, as we euphemistically call it. And I think we've got a lot of lessons to learn. I've talked about the lessons of the Middle East and the vacuums that have been caused there. Very much the denuding of our ability to tackle parts of the Middle East because of our rushing into places like Iraq and these kind of things, which has helped affect a domestic audience. So I think we have progressed over the last couple of decades in particular to actually be able to share our experiences with governments like Sri Lanka. And I hope that actually we can just work together and have these lessons. But last thing that we must have is be here in 2 years' time and say that there is no progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. You very usefully opened up the debate on the future and our responsibilities in that future. Rather than comment on that myself, I'm going to open it up to the floor. We don't have too much time, but I'll be your comments and questions are very welcome. You're uncharacteristically silent.
Gowing. So let's get Bowie.
We have seen all the progress and non-progress in the last 1.5 years, and again in the last 6 months. Much needed to be done. How? For example, apart from those lands to be released, detainees list, comprehensive detainee list to be released. There are so many other things to be done. For example, as per the resolution 30/1, there are laws to be enacted according to the international standards, including the war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. That has to be done, but there is nothing we knew about, any progress about on that matter. Unless that is enacted, any special court, any special council, or any serious judicial process cannot take place. So that is another process. Do we think this could be processed and completed in the next 18 months? If it is not, what are the options available? Do we have any timeline plan from the international community, so from the government, to work out this in an orderly manner simultaneously and show progress, reasonable progress, from now until 2019 to achieve these goals and objectives? That is something we need to pressurize through the international community. Failing that, what are the alternative options? One of the alternative options, as suggested by High Commissioner, was universal jurisdiction. We want your expertise of how we can use this, whether the political willingness or diplomatic hurdles will stop this process from each country, particularly those countries uphold the human rights values in Europe or South America. So now the perpetrators of the war have been appointed as diplomats, and they are roaming around the world. Yeah. There is nothing to stop. So at least if we are serious about human rights values, is there any country going to take these measures as an example to follow? Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll take them one by one.
Yeah.
Would you?
Yeah, I can take some of those. Thanks very much. In terms of timetable, I can't speak for every government. Clearly, I can speak. Well, I can't even speak for the UK government because I'm not a member of it. But I have spoken to the Foreign Minister about this as chairman of the APPG, and this is an issue that he takes, and the UK government takes incredibly seriously. Their responsibility to help, as I say, as critical friends of Sri Lanka in this regard. And I know that they don't want to leave it until 2019. They're looking at next year, next time we're back here, that they want to see considerable progress. In terms of how that may happen, you've seen from the campaign grips, the RAG, the red, amber, green charts. I think they're helpful to actually focus minds on the areas that we can most bring in pressure. But in terms of that, there really needs to be two angles. There needs to be two areas of diplomacy. When you're talking about people roaming the world, there's the obvious example of Jayasuriya, who returned from Brazil, and I called for a red alert for the Interpol to arrest him on that basis. But on the other hand, that's all very well. That's quite loud megaphone diplomacy, I admit. But it does need to be brought to the world that actually there are people accused of some incredibly heinous crimes that are being posted in various senior positions around the world. But there also needs to be quiet diplomacy as well. This idea that not everything needs to happen by the media, that we can work with the Sri Lankan government to actually effect quiet change as well. There's an economic impetus as well. To my mind, GSP Plus was given too early to Sri Lanka, but what I don't want to do is necessarily to look at things like punitive measures like sanctions, because I don't want to be impoverishing a whole country for the inaction of a few. So we've got to get that right as well. But then the legal aspects I'll leave to someone else, possibly to my right.
Yes. Go ahead.
Thank you. I think what's come out of the whole discussion is that there is cautious optimism that by 2019 there may be systems in place for effective change. But I think your question is entirely right, to have an element of scepticism and a parallel plan in terms of what can be achieved if the best case scenario doesn't happen in 2019. And of course there are a range of possible options if we get to the 2019 point and nothing happens. There was a call at the 24th session of the Human Rights Council for the Sri Lankan government to be immediately referred to the ICC. I think, in my view, that is premature if we are trying to work towards a constructive resolution. But of course it is an option that if there isn't effective change, either there could be a referral to the UN Security Council, there could be the deployment of peacekeepers if we're looking at addressing issues on the ground, or of course there could be a referral to the ICC. Which brings on to your question of universal jurisdiction, which for those of you who aren't entirely familiar, is of course the assertion of jurisdiction over the most serious of crimes, regardless of where those crimes are committed, the nationality of the perpetrators or the victims. In itself, universal jurisdiction is a difficult matter, and maybe this is something again I'll defer to Paul to in terms of the British government's approach. Looking at the British example, of course, there have been instances of universal jurisdiction having been exercised, and the 2009 example of Livni and the arrest warrant in relation to war crimes committed in the Gaza Strip in the 2008-2009 period. There was a warrant issued by a London court, but of course was not effective because Livni chose not to travel to the UK, having been forewarned. So there is an issue in terms of the effectiveness of such a warrant. Of course, there's a further issue. There has been debate at the most senior of levels as to whether universal jurisdiction is appropriately defined, whether it impacts on state sovereignty. And there have been, so following the Gaza example, the British government looked to, in my view, constrain the effective application of universal jurisdiction by saying it was necessary to refer to the Attorney General before a warrant could be issued. And of course the BTF and members of the BTF will know well, back in 2010 the steps were taken to issue a warrant against Rajapaksa and senior members of his entourage. when he visited the UK in 2010. So of course it is an option. It is not one that's simple. It's something that potentially requires the most senior commitment from at the British government level. Maybe that's something that Paul could pick up on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I must admit, I think at this stage, you know, when we look at the some of the people, some of the crimes they've been accused of, I just think it's a little bit early, because I think if you start applying things like universal jurisdiction at this stage, you're really shutting down relations with the Sri Lankan government. Like as I was talking about, that twin track approach of diplomacy, I suspect, as I say, I can't speak for them, but I suspect it's been a little bit too early in the process to go down that line at the moment.
Yes. Slide. Yes. Angela.
Mr. Scully. I'm Yves. I represent Center for Human Rights and Development back in Sri Lanka. My question is, since the counter-terrorism bill is a work in progress, and since it has not been made public, I just want to know what are the measures carried out by the British government in order to ensure that this bill is in compliance with international standards. And my other question, it's just a comment, it's not a question. We have been speaking with the families of the disappeared, and what they have been telling us is that they want 2 Tamil-speaking representatives as commissioners in the OMP. So those are the 2 things we just wanted to mention.
Thank you. I'll certainly take back your comments about the OMP and the 2 Tamil speakers and see what I can find out about that. In terms of the former, again, I can't tell you what the government have done. What I can say is what Ben Emerson found out, because this is only in July this year, so we're talking about 2 months. He was talking about them coming back within 2 weeks to have those discussions. I'm not sure if they've had those discussions, because what they hadn't done, as far as I understand, the Sri Lankan government hadn't consulted particularly widely in the successor bit of legislation, and so he talked about the fact that the law still guaranteed the continued violation of the human rights of terror suspects, and it still preserved the admissibility of confessions made to police officers in custody. So there were still things in there that really didn't comply, as Antonia said, with a modern day Terrorism Act. So clearly it needs work. And if the UK government can get involved in that, I'm sure it will, because we all want it to work. But whether the Sri Lankan government have actually asked for it, or whether they're amenable to that support, I couldn't tell you at the moment in time.
Thank you. I'm going to take one last question, if there is one. Martha?
கடந்த மார்ச் செஷன் மெனோட்டியில் சொல்லியிருந்தேன் பயங்கரவாத தடுப்பு ஃபங்க்ஷன் வந்து குறைஞ்சிருக்கு ஸ்ரீலங்கா.
Last March, Manotega had said that the PTA actions have reduced.
ஆனாலும் அந்த ஃபங்க்ஷன் குறைஞ்சிட்டுன்னு சொல்லியிருக்கணும். ஆனால் இந்த செப்டம்பர் மாதம் 15ஆம் தேதி
But this September
15ஆம் தேதி
15th,
இந்தியாவில் இருந்து வந்த ஒரு former 64 வயதுடைய ஒருவர் அரெஸ்ட் பண்ணப்பட்டிருக்கார்.
a 64-year-old returnee from India has been arrested under PTA.
அவருக்கு கேன்சர் வியாதி இருந்தபடியால் ஒரு ஸ்ட்ராங் வெயிட் கண்டிஷனில் அவர் வெளியில் வந்திருக்கிறார்.
Because he's got cancer, he's being let out with a strong weight condition.
அதை விட வந்து 2017 வந்து அரெஸ்ட் பண்ணப்பட்டிருக்கணும் பிடிஏ இல்லாமல் கூறிய ஆயுதங்கள் வைத்திருக்கிறது, ட்ரக்ஸ் வைத்திருக்கிற சட்டத்துக்களால் அரெஸ்ட் பண்ணுறாங்க தமிழ் இளைஞர்களை. ஆனால் வந்து டிஐடி தான் அவர்களுடைய இன்வெஸ்டிகேஷனை செய்கிறாங்க.
2017, quite a few youngsters have been arrested under the pretense of alcohol and misuse and all other different laws, but they're being held by the TID, which is basically the people using PTA. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Bartender, for bringing us back to the realities on the ground. I see that we are now run out of time and that other people are waiting. So I'm going to thank everybody for coming, thank the organisers for sponsoring this event, and above all to thank our panellists for having shared their thoughts with us today on a very disturbing situation, which surely will be the subject of discussion in the coming 6 months and beyond. Thank you.
On behalf of Pasumai, Thaayagam, PTM and USTPAC, we would like to